Hey, it's Joe West from the West Barn with
Mike Shimshack?
today. I'm giving an introduction for a man that maybe needs no introduction. He's a producer, engineer, inventor, educator, Mr. George Massenburg. He's a Grammy Award and ACM Award winner, Tech Award winner, Tech Hall of Fame, AES Gold member, honorary doctorate from Berkeley. Also, the inventor of the modern version of the Parametric EQ, which we'll talk a little bit about. He's worked on over 400 records in the past 45 years, including just some seminal records that we've all used to determine whether our low end and high end is right. For Lyle Lovett, Earth, Wind and Fire, James Taylor, Billy Joel, Toto, Dixie Chicks, Journey, Little Feat, Weather Report, Aaron Neville, Kenny Loggins, Linda Ronstadt. It goes on and on and on. He's an educator as well. He is at the McGill School, or the McGill University in Canada. And we are just ecstatic to have him on. Please welcome to the show, George Massenburg.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Insert applause here.
I'm hoping we've got questions. I'm hoping we've got some students here and we've got questions coming in.
Well, I'm glad you say that. Our podcast is a deep dive for people that are technical. We find that people want to know the same nerdy stuff that we want to know. And when we get a hold of a guy that shaped the history of recorded music, it's like no better time to bring him out. I want to talk to you. I've been watching videos of you the last 24 hours, and what I'm really struck with is that here's maybe a guy that knows everything that I want to know. But it seems as though when he makes a record, he is able to scale it down to what he feels is most important. Even though he knows maybe how to build the compressor and EQ, he realizes what's important, which is the artist. I heard you talking a lot about getting headphone mixes right, about giving people the environment to create, to not foisting your opinion on people, but being someone that is really a conduit to get great recordings. And I just want to know, how do you scale that? How do you scale your ability to decide what in that brain is important at the moment on a record?
I come to you at a rare moment of utter humility, because when we lost Al Schmitt last week, we all realized how much we wanted to be like Al Schmitt. And it started with his incredible kindness. And I realized I'm not very kind in the studio to second engineers and to myself. And so it's been a great sobering experience this week. And this thing that we did on Monday, the Al Schmitt Wake, I really recommend that. It's up on YouTube permanently now, and you look for it under Pure Mixer, Andrew Sheps, and the Meta Group. But here's why I'm so different from Al, and I made a point of being different from Al because there's only one Al Schmitt. And what's different about me is every record I went into, I went from scratch. I mean, I had a couple of favorite things that I would return to, but generally, musically and mixing-wise, I would, and still do, want to go from scratch. Let's build a new record rather than repeating the same old formula or formulaic approach or workflow that may have provided a hit record for an artist. I don't know. Maybe the artist has a way he or she wants to work, and I think that might be rediscovered as well. In fact, artists like David Bowie make a point of saying that they reinvent themselves every 3 years, and here's a new David Bowie. So I go off of that, and I start off from that point. Is if I can reinvent myself and long ago, I realized I wasn't doing it for money. I mean, I have to make money. We have house payments and kids and ex-wives, but the money was never the most important thing. In fact, some of the best records I've done have been for free.
That's a good point.
So when you say that you start from scratch, are you saying you have no preconceived idea what you're going to use for microphones, compressors? What exactly do you mean when you say you're starting from scratch?
Well, I've got a big bag of tricks. So
bet you do.
and I've got a lot of mics that I can pick from. But I'm not sort of doctrinaire in what I use for what. I mean, I've got a couple of go-to bass DIs, active bass DIs that go all the way down. But the way I'll start a record, I think, is to research what an artist has in his or her ear and heart. And in Linda Ronstadt's case, she's the artist of my life, and I owe her everything for teaching me how to listen to a song. We would start by listening to the best of the genre. When she did the Nelson Riddle record, went back and listened to a lot of Ella and Frank and Henry Mancini because of Al's recording. And just to get a sense of what that was. When we did the mariachi record, she provided me with some reference records, often mono, out of the mariachi culture. And old stuff recorded in people's parlors. And that's how I kind of modeled the sound and how I approached it. I learned a lot about working with musicians and about the groove, that whole mariachi groove, because it's not four on the floor. It's ga on the fuela, and had to learn what that was, what that musical currency was. So yeah, the best records I've done, I think, I've known about the culture behind them, whatever that is. In Little Feat, it was definitely a rock and roll culture, and talking to the guys and extracting what they love. And Lowell loved Billy Payne loved Professor Longhair, and they all loved the New Orleans thing, and I just came along at the right time. I'm jumping around, but I look for a cultural reference, and build off that.
I think I'm interested in knowing, like, how do you scale? It's got to be seamless after 45 years. How do you scale from being a designer and knowing every nuance of a piece of technology and maybe a mic placement, a philosophy of recording, and then you scale? I watched you do this video on your GML 8200 EQ, where you're searching with a piano and a vocal, and I'm thinking to myself, it's interesting because he's instantaneously going from a real clinician to finding the heart of the matter, the vocal and that instrument, right? It's like, yeah. I think that's the real skill with these legends that we get to talk to, is being able to be like, so people don't see it, but it's like you're digging deep when you have to, but then you're on the surface making sure that everything is what it needs to be emotionally.
So I was maybe a little insincere when I say I don't repeat myself, because for instance, in learning how to do country music, or Nashville music, or acoustic music, it starts from a different place than a jazz session or an R&B session, modern or old, would start from. And for instance, with a Nashville session, you start with the vocal and the songwriting instrument. Maybe the songwriting instrument is a guitar, maybe it's a piano, but that's the center of your mix. And it's kind of I learned a lot from Clear Mountain, and I think he's a brilliant engineer, and I have the utmost respect for him. But the way he would start a rock and roll mix was with the rock and roll writing instrument and the vocal. And early on, I didn't know any of that. Early on, I came out of a recording experience in Baltimore, Maryland, and we listened to records and tried to do sound-alikes of records. We still teach that, by the way, to kids. If you want to learn what went into a record, try to replicate it. Go for that guitar sound. Try to figure out how to get that sound. Burn that sound in your mind's ear, and have that in your toolkit over here. You want that guitar sound? Well, it's right down here. And here it is. But I started out knowing nothing, except that I loved R&B. Loved R&B. Loved Philadelphia. Loved Motown. And when we finally, it was Stax Records was revealed to us, we would get every record that Stax ever. My friend Greg Novick and I, and would get every record that Stax put out and listen to it long into the night, and learn from what they did. And it was just feel. It's all about groove. And we tried to make a record. My last year that I went to Johns Hopkins was my sophomore year, and we made and I dropped out. I'm a college dropout. And we made a record and took it to Stax and played it for Steve Cropper. And it was a peak moment of my life, sitting down with Steve Cropper and being able to play our record. This is in 68 or 69. And the Barkays were walking in, and I'm just back from the road, and David Porter walked in, and Charlie Chalmers was working on an arrangement, and just electrifying experiences. But it goes back to looking for the heart of music, finding the heart of music and revealing the heart of music. It's thrilling. I get a thrill.
I learned that from a regular engineer 10, 15 years in. I was slow because I didn't have a good mentor. I had a great mentor at the beginning, but during the creative portion of my life, I learned much, and I took this from watching your interviews, that if you know all the technology the best you can, be prepared to have a bunch of bags of tricks, a bunch of drawers of like how to deal with solve problems. Make that transparent to the artist. But it becomes incredibly simple when you do what you just said, which is bring up the heart of the song. I found that once I brought up the heart of the song, and if I knew that, hey, this was written on piano or guitar and vocal, it was almost easy. It decoded itself, because as magical as a record is, there's a technology base. Once you have the technology base, if you can add that magical, every record wants to decode itself. And I spent my years fighting records, fighting them with EQ, fighting them with too loud a kick drums or guitars too loud, and missing the point of it.
Well, again, Al Schmitt is the great example, because somebody quoted John McBride as saying, after he did a session with Martina, that and John McBride showed up early to the Martina session, showed up at 5 a.m. and watched everybody doing what they did. And at the end of the day, they'd done a bunch of tunes, a lot of tunes in a day. And Steve Genowick asked McBride, well, what did you see? And he said, that's the most complicated nothing I've ever seen. Because Al made it all just very simple. You know, he wouldn't, for instance, on drums, Andrew Sheps the other day was talking about when Andrew Sheps was in a session, saw Al bring mics up, and the first thing Andrew wanted to do is reach in and high-frequency shelve on the drum overheads. Al didn't do that. Al used very little EQ. Move microphones and get mics in the right place. And Andrew was saying that, and he didn't know how, he kind of set everything up and came downbeat, and bam, it was all there.
Yeah.
And it was great, and it was big, and he was speechless, and Andrew said he just started laughing. And I think Al shushed him, but it's utter simplicity and just trusting in if you can find the heart of it, that it plays itself. And so Al's piano sound, I mean, I came late to Al's piano sound, and I have this piano sound that I like, and I think it's proven itself. But I like Al's sound too, a piano sound. And I would go back to him and ask him, and every time I'd ask him, it was a little different answer. So generally we ask Genowick, we generally put the mics. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. But trying to find the musical heart is fundamental.
Are you of the same belief? Did you not EQ a whole lot? Were you moving the mics just to get the sound right? Same school?
No, coming up, it was all about EQ, and it didn't work. I mean, my first few, because we didn't have anything. I mean, I didn't invent, because nothing's new, but I crafted this EQ with a guy I worked with named Burgess McNeil, who kind of went his own way, but he and Bob Mushaw and I came up with this circuit, and then I refined it. I spent days and nights refining this circuit, adding the Q control and finding a topology that actually did the right job. And then I'd use it on fucking everything, but primarily on acoustic guitar to notch out the Helmholtz resonator in an acoustic guitar, and on a snare drum to control in particular the primary resonance, and then other little resonances. But And it took me years to figure out I was taking out, especially in a snare drum, in a raging rock and roll snare drum, I was taking out the rock and roll. It wanted to have a crack in it. So, I mean, that was early on. I've been doing this for a long time. But I tried to invent it on my own, thinking that that's what made these Motown records great. That's what made these Stax records. And I'd go look at them, especially in the case of Stax, and they weren't doing anything. They were just turning it on and playing a groove.
Well, and let's not forget, for those watching, before a parametric EQ, you were dealing with filters, passive filters sometimes, or things that you could get to areas or fixed bands, right?
I was dealing with a Cinema Engineering EQ. It had a 10K shelf or a 3 or 5K peak, and then roll-offs at either end. Low end was fixed at 100. And that's where I started with the Cinema EQ.
And those are passive, right? The Cinemas were passive.
It was, and it did nothing useful. And then we got an Altix 7-band graphic. And thinking, well, this will do it. I can find those free. No, it's horrible.
But it was
still hate graphics.
Yes, you're an inventor, but it's more of a facilitator to get a job done. You needed something more than what you had, so you're like, "What heck? I'm going to go make this."
Well, and we built our own 4-track. We didn't have any money to buy a machine, so we built a 4-track out of old Ampex 300 parts. I started on 300s and 351s. Early on, after I'd made some money doing something, I bought a PR10, which is the worst recorder Ampex ever made. It's just horrible. But I would cart that around and do high school bands. And I mean, this is when I was like 15, right. 16. My mother would drive me to these gigs and pick me up. And I'd record anything. It was just magic to me. Ed Cherney used to say, George, I just think it's a miracle that you can put music through a wire. And I thought recording was like that. It was just great. Yeah. There was something magical about it.
Yeah, and I was just taken by the fact that it was like, I want to do this and I can't do it with what I have. So what do?
Build it. Yeah, I still do that.
You build it. I don't build it because I don't have that. I can't fathom that.
I still do that, and I do it more often in software than hardware. I mean, I'll model hardware. It's not good to breathe in rosin core solder fumes. You really want to have ventilation for that. So I'll model in MATLAB and Simulink, and it's a lot easier. Maybe it leads to a different result, but it's a lot easier than soldering transistors. But I would spend when I was developing this op amp that we still use to this day in 8200s. I started in Paris, then we moved to Hollywood, and I started trying to build the great op amp. And I thought I did, but it was very unreliable because the second stage, although it was fast, tended to blow up. And so I tried to productize that, and it was not good. And then I built another op amp. But I started with the very basics of what makes a gain stage good and bad. And I loved Rupert, and I loved the sound of those consoles, but they're dark. I always thought they were dark. I love working on APIs, but it was colored. The ends were defined by staggered roll-offs, and the low frequency response was punchy, but it was not flat, and I was looking for flat. The high end was the same story, going through all these transformers. A friend of mine that I grew up with, Dean Jensen, grew up down the street from me. He had moved from New Jersey. We had moved from a small town near Philadelphia. And so as a kid, I grew up with Dean Jensen. And I'm talking 11, 12, 13. And so he was kind of my early mentor. And he, as you know, went off and built transformers. I never liked transformers. So there was a point where we didn't talk to each other for a while. But I think I did a good job of Transformerless, and he did about the best job of Transformers.
That's an interesting point. It's like so many of these consoles we lean on because they have a sound. If you were in New York City in the late 90s to early 2000s, if you walked into an SSL room, you knew where the meters were going to be on the desk because it produced a sound that was not maybe good on an oscilloscope. but it was pleasing to the ears, right?
Well, not to my ear. In fact, the SSL was kind of bright and gritty and crappy, and you had to run it into a Studer A80 or A800 or whatever, because that would roll it off. And they kind of shook hands, the SSL and the Studer. I hated them both and thought that digital was the answer. And unfortunately, a lot of that middle period when I was recording, I made some pretty good records that were locked into 48K 16-bit. And, you know, my buddies were all working on tape, and they can resurrect their sessions and remix them for surround or immersive or whatever. Elliot's a great mixer, a great surround mixer, and when you can get the tape. But unfortunately, a lot of the tapes got burnt down in the Universal fire.
Yeah.
That's another real stab in the back, that record companies did not do due diligence with their assets. That's a real lesson.
We want to thank Elliot Shiner, by the way. He's how we got access to you.
He shamed me into doing this. That's right.
Well, good. We'll take you however we can get you. So I want to ask you about, what you prefer. We were talking to Frank Philpetti, and he brought you up and was saying, like, you can hear things that he can't hear. So he was saying he likes 96K or that iteration. What are you looking for right now when you're recording records digitally?
Well, I want to hear the music. So I'll set it up. I'll set up as much as I can. And based on what I think I'm going to need. And I will start with the same kind of drum setup. I'll have alternate overheads. I have a dynamic like a Beyer M201 and condenser like a Sanken CU44X, and move a lot of mics around on drums. I'll start there. But generally, and I'm getting off the subject, I'm getting away from your question.
I was asking, I want to get on that, what you're talking about, but I was asking about like sample frequency. And what
I want to hear is the possibility of having highs on the drums, or the possibility of having punch on the kicker, the possibility of having low. And so that when I get on a console, I just dance on it a little bit here, a little bit there, and I'm just painting using colors from this palette, and I hope that they're there. But I've set the recording up so that they are available when I go to mix, and I forget about everything. When I think the best mixers are like that. I think Schmitt is like that. Schmitt is one of the best mixers I've ever seen work. He's fast, goes from the heart, but he gets on a console and he's dancing. He's just dancing. And I think great engineering is a dance. But what you have to have is enough colors on your palette so that you can reach for them with muscle memory. You know, I don't know how to describe it, but you just are drawn to. You know, we use two technologies on the guitar amp. Usually, it's a 57 and a 121 ribbon. And we set them up by ear very carefully, get them to work. Sometimes they're offset. It gives you a nice dip, a nice cancellation that you'll use. And you reach for whatever works with the tune. You just reach for it. It's a color, and you reach for it. So I still like to have those options, so that you can develop a mix. I also have a ton of effects. I won't use them, but I'll have a ton of effects. I'll have especially if we're doing immersive, I have a ton of delays. I have a bunch of H3000 plugs. I just got an H9000 that I'm going to screw around with it. My friend for the last 50 years, Tony Agnello, designed. I used to have depended on 2016, SP 2016. Mick Kozowski and I were big fans of a 2016. It's just the most beautiful long reverb ever. But I'll have all of these things rather than looking for highs and lows, because audiophiles do not help sell records. I'm sorry. I love you guys, but you're not being very helpful. But I do like this. Can you see this?
Mm-hmm.
You know what this is?
It looks like a converter.
It is a MQA-enabled DAC. And it's a terrific DAC with MQA firmware. So I'll get you to look up MQA when we're off the phone. But man that I deeply respect, two men, Bob Stewart and Peter Craven, came up with a process to more closely or better use the 24-bit data space at 96K or 192 or 384, 768 or whatever. I love recording at 192, but I run out of resources in doing rock and roll production. Generally, we use 96, but this, if we mix at 96K, the process of MQA encoding gives you something that uses 4824 pipe, like Tidal, and one of these DACs restores it to 96K. And it's kind of magical, Peter Craven's algorithm. He calls it origami, but it's a way to better use the data space that we agree is not being very well used. I mean, very few records have 0 dB full-scale components at 40K. You don't hear 40K directly, but you hear the influence of high frequencies on localization, spatial information, haptic information. It's important to have these details, this lace and filigree, for the great acoustic recorded performance. So I'm trying to make this work.
I'm trying to understand, where would that go in your workflow?
Well, it goes a couple places. When we finish a mix, we have a 96K master. If we don't do anything else, maybe we'll make that a MQA encoded 44116 for a CD, or an MQA encoded 4824 for Tidal or whatever. These services are just beginning to light up 5 years later. So it is an encoded master and a decoded playback. So it's two-sided. But it sounds okay without it. I mean, I can play an MQA encoded 4824 mix, and it sounds fine. Mm-hmm. But this takes the two bottom bits, which are usually buried in noise. Don't let anybody tell you that you can make a 32-bit A to D converter, because that is a fantasy and a lie. There's no such thing. Sorry, ESS, I'm not buying it. But we're trying to get really good 22-bit. That's right around the noise floor, 22 bits. Really good 22 bits. So we can use those last 2 bits as MQA signaling. So that's one clue. But the other thing is this, is that if we monitor with MQA, it does something to correct a D to A's crappy performance. The modern D to A's have apodizing filters, and that's gone a long way to take the ringing out. A lot of things that we do in recording and mixing, I would propose are just mistakes, because we're not hearing stuff very well. And you don't hear well, you're going to make bad choices. And this thing where, we listen to mixes 100, 200, 500 times. You can hear the grass grow. You want to hear the grass grow. You want to hear the lace and filigree. You want to hear detail. And in general, a D to A's performance gets in the way of that. Part of what we like about going to higher sample rates is that the D to A performs better. A to D performs better too, because the filter is less audible, the artifacts from the filter. I'm running on and on. I don't know whether you want to get this technical, but I'm a huge fan of MQA. And
so people would need one of these to decode the signal. It's like an encoded signal.
Yes.
But they could listen without it and still get a normal listening experience.
It's still a normal listening experience. But I mean, originally these were expensive. This is from China, cost $99.
Wow.
And it sounds great.
But
And
you would, as the mixer, you would have to generate a file format and encode it with that.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because what they've provided is a way to mix to anticipate the process called the MQA Pro Encoder. And it's a plugin, VSTAU plugin, and you can use it in Pro Tools with like a Blue Cat wrapper. You mix through it, and that would go into an MQA-enabled DAC, and you hear what MQA is going to do with the final product. So my dismay is how much misinformation there is on this. There's a guy that just went on YouTube and raved about what a ripoff this was, and it's a con, and Bob Stewart's a con artist, and he's not. He's brilliant. And Peter Craven's one of the most brilliant men in audio in the last 50 years. It's not a ripoff. It does cost something, though. It's something that you have to buy. But a couple of things about this is that the listening experience is less stressful. You know, we learned how to mix in analog where we would stay up all night and mix all night. And as we got into digital, something pulled us away from mixing all night. You know, it was, after a while, listening to digital, uncorrected digital is annoying. It really is annoying. We had the Ajax men of science telling us it's not annoying. Look, it's perfect. Sony's men of science say it's perfect. Perfect sound forever, and it's a lie. They're lying. They're selling you bullshit. They're lying. It's not perfect, but this is a step towards perfectibility. I don't get paid for this, by the way.
So what is the audible difference?
I had to buy this.
What we'll hear through this process, encoding and decoding.
Here's the problem with the guys that are trying to bust this, is it doesn't A-B. You can't say A, B, A, B. Oh, that's better. That's better. That's worse. You have to kind of relax and listen to music. You have to listen from your other ear.
That's a great point. The grandma ear.
Your musical ear.
Yeah, the
You have to
uneducated
listen.
sort of. There's that moment where you can zoom out from a mix and hear it for the first time again.
That's right. And funny you should mention, because one of my recommended techniques in listening to immersive is, rather than listen to everything here in the sweet spot, I mean, I've got a 714 system here, but I'll go into the bedroom and listen from the other room when I want to get a sense of the mix as a blend and as presentation. And just relax. You've got to relax to work with music. You got to be relaxed, and it helps if you're working with somebody who has a good sense of humor and you can tell good jokes. And that was Ed Cherney's magic, is he had these great things he would do to loosen up a session.
Well, that's a good point. You know, I have spent my life trying to be able to simultaneously listen to a record like my grandmother and also listen to it as if I was the most studious, intent, myopic engineer. You know, it's being able to zoom from one personality to another to get new listens, to be able to get rid of ear fatigue, to be able to get fresh impressions.
Yeah.
That's been the challenge of a lifetime.
It's hard.
It's very hard to do.
Do you take a lot of breaks when you work, George?
I do work sporadically. I mean, and I'll listen very quietly until it's time to really listen critically. Barely audible. And when I'm working in the studio with a second engineer, they can't chew gum. They can barely breathe. God help them if they start coughing. Because I listen very quietly until I'm listening for impact, and then I crank it.
I heard you tell a story where, or read a story where you said they had voted you off of the record, the Earth, Wind, and Fire record.
Yeah, the very first record I did, here I was living in Paris with X1, and we went to. She was shooting a movie. She was an actress, model, whatever, shooting a movie, and we went to Corsica to do this B film, and came back to my apartment in Paris and had telexes. We didn't have a phone. And mailbox full of telexes from Clyde Bikimo at Warner's, and that turned into doing Little Feat at the studio that I built in Baltimore. But the managers of Little Feat, Joe Ruffalo and Bob Cavallo, introduced the idea of my working with Earth, Wind & Fire. Finished the Little Feat record back in Paris, and I get a call, would you like to come do Earth, Wind & Fire? And you won't have to mix it, and just see how you work out with this group. So I showed up to Caribou Ranch a day ahead of time and did what I generally do, which is get the studio together, get things set up, and fix the instruments. Now, in Earth, Wind & Fire's case, it was a big job because none of the guys knew how to tune a bridge on a guitar. So I had this strobe tuner, Peterson strobe tuner, and one of the big things I used to do I didn't tell you about early bluegrass records, but I would tune the band with this Peterson strobe tuner, sometimes from the control room. And of course, they're endemic now, but so I tune the instruments, and Earth, Wind & Fire comes in, they play through a couple of tracks, and they come in the studio, and I'm working on COS electrostatic headphones, and I play it back real kind of quiet, and we do a playback, and Al McKay says, we got to have a band meeting. Takes Maurice into the hallway and says, get rid of this guy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And I knew a lot about R&B at that point. I mean, I could talk R&B. Came back in, and Maurice said, listen, looky here. Play it again, but turn it up. Turn it way up. So remember the early Hidley rooms had the quad speakers, so I turned it up to 11 front and back speakers, and it was rocking. So I kept the gig, but boy, it was touch and go. Yeah.
Well, that's part of probably a learning curve. You know, it's like there's a part of this where you need to feel it.
Yeah.
Right? It's an experience.
I had come out of classical and acoustic music and bluegrass, and it was my first time in an R&B studio, although I loved R&B. I didn't know to turn it up, that you got to get the room dancing. And the lesson kept coming home. When Linda and I did the Frenesy, the Afro-Cuban jazz record, the way you gauged a recording, gauged the performance was, is there a conga line around the control room? If
right.
Nobody's dancing, then you're back to square one.
Yep. And in New York, in the early days, it was like I couldn't use any of the far-field monitors. The only thing they were good for was rattling people's pant legs, to play back and get everybody excited about it so they go out and they feel like superhumans.
That's the idea. And
right.
By the way, that's where a good headphone mix comes to play, because you really have to light up. You have to be responsible for the performance if you're working on phones. And as much as we try to avoid phones, sometimes it's impossible not to have phones. And you've got to light the artist up. The artist has to want to sing into this emerging performance. Stay on top of it.
I was captivated, but you told a story about the room that you built down at Blackbird, the all diffused room, in making records in that room on headphones, and all being about the headphone mix. And I've got a barn, an open form control room with just a couple ISO booths, but we work together for the most part under headphones.
I love that. Yeah.
I just took a phone call from a friend who's considering doing it, and I just told him, I said, I've never regretted it in 10 years. There's things that I wish I could do at a moment, but it's never outweighs the benefit of just being purely immersed in it.
And you're in immediate contact with the musician. Somebody plays something, you smile. The artist does something weird, you can kind of wince. That immediate contact. Peter Antonio and I did who's the guy that started RPG, and great guy, and helped me a lot with some learning about basic math. Primarily very high random numbers, big random numbers, and how to develop that primitive root diffuser, knowing a little bit about number theory. And so I went back to school and learned about number theory. But we gave a presentation at the ASA in Providence, and some heavy hitters were in the audience, heavy hitters. Leo Benarek, for one, who at that time was, I think, 91. And when we were done presenting and I had played a piece of music and showed what we did, he said, "I don't understand. How can you get a kick sound on headphones?" And I said, "Well, I've been doing this for a long time, some 35, 40 years. And if I don't know how to get a kick sound in that time, I really should go into chartered accountancy. That I don't have to be pummeled by a kick at 120 dB SPL to get a kick sound. I know what it is." And that's what I found I was doing in the room. I could hear better on phones because it was immediate. And in fact, I used to use these. These are Etymologic Research. These are very good earbuds, and I like them. The other ones that I use, that you'll see by my board, are Odysseys. These, I think these are brilliant. And you notice that they're all cracked up because I've been all over the world with them, and they're falling apart, and I still use them. These are great. It's a planar loudspeaker. It's had two planar speakers on the other side of your head.
Nice.
And then I verify what I've got on speakers.
Right.
Listen to it again on speakers.
I can remember I had a head cold once and I was making a record, and I was able to still work on that record and do a lot of things that needed done on the record by just flying by the meters as if you were a pilot.
There's a great story about that we told the other day. You guys should have seen this Al Schmitt thing.
We'll link it in the description.
Okay, so one of the stories, and I'm surprised Elliot didn't tell the story, but one of the stories was, and I'm not going to do the whole story, but Al Schmitt is mixing Peg, Steely Dan thing that he just recorded in Studio One, the back studio at Sunset. And Gary Katz and Walter and Donald walked in and looking around, there's Al mixing, but they can't hear anything. And they think he's got the monitors turned off. So they go away. They call Elliot later and say, "Elliot, I hope, if Elliot's listening, I hope I've got this story right." But he got it right on the Al Schmitt thing. He said, Al was mixing and he was just staring at the meters. He wasn't hearing anything. And they asked Al later, he said, "Yeah, the monitors were very low, but he wanted everybody to believe that he was mixing looking at meters." And that became great folklore.
That's amazing.
Well, it is a testament. You do something a million times, and you'll know, you'll be able to feel where the kick drum mic should be. And you can do it on headphones. And if your concern is making the art right, keeping the creativity going, it's your job to have done it a million times so that you have a known outcome. That's why you're in the room.
And the worst thing you can do is stop the creative process, is when things start moving, things start flowing. You hear a buzz, and you haven't done your job to get rid of the buzz ahead of time. You got to let it go and fix it later. Fix it later.
That's a great point.
Let the artistic energy flow. Let it move along.
That's a great point, and it goes contrary to it's as if a mosquito landed on your arm and you could swat it away, but you know that you shouldn't. It's that kind of
good point.
For us people that are so focused on known outcomes, we don't want that. But then that's why it's so impressive. You've been able to have this right brain, left brain thing. Very rare to have somebody that is able to say, I'm going to now analyze what's more important right now, the creativity or my perfection. And maybe the creativity winning out trumps my perfection.
Yeah, and you have to do that every 5 seconds. Actually, it's 3 things. You mix from your head, your heart, and your guts. Those 3 things. And your head is fine detail, minutia. What's important for a producer is agenda. The producer's job is maintaining an agenda. Make no mistake. That's the number 1 gig. The agenda. Is this striking my heart? Do I love this? Really important. Does it have punch? Is it going to dance? That's the guts. And you're constantly balancing these things. And hardest thing to teach kids is you have to stay awake. You have to pay attention. And you have to pay attention and refresh that every few seconds. Not every 5 minutes, not on a playback. Every few seconds, you have to come to and say, who am I? Where am I? What do I hear? What do I feel? 5 seconds later, where am I? Who
These
am
are
I?
conversations that go right over the top of my 20-year-old head. When I was a 20-year-old,
And
I've sat in weddings and funerals and heard cliche lines that at the right time killed me, like disassembled me, but I heard them a million times prior. I'm telling you, if you're young and listening to this podcast, everything that makes people makes them masters at what they do is this. It's the little cherries on top. It's the having the horse sense to be able to listen 6 different ways, to be able to stay centered, to be the producer and have to maintain the agenda with the record label and the schedule at the studio, as well as make sure that it's killing you right there in the room at the same time. This multitasking and being aware of this stuff, it's what makes recordings incredible rather than just recordings.
I think that's true.
I believe that. I wanted to ask you, in that 8200, I have a question for you. The 8200 used to have dip switches for the in and out. Now they have push buttons, right? Latching buttons.
Yeah, but that changed early on. That changed a million years ago. The really old ones still have the paddle switches.
My buddy Al Thura has the paddle switch version.
Yeah.
I have heard that the paddle switch version sounds better than the push button version. Is there any
you
truth
would
to
hear
that?
that. I don't think it's true, and or I would use it. But I mean, I've got them here.
There's
the paddle switch version. But by the way, in the early days of the, I guess it's the 8200, we used a 5534 as the feedback amp. I mean, that whole thing at the heart of my Parametric is a bridge T filter. It's a bridge T filter is different than a state variable filter. State variables, multiple op amp, 3 op amps with a couple of resistors between them, feedback and state variable filter. It's not very good for detail because the open loop gain required of the op amps is such that you're stressing these monolithic op amps, and you're hitting a limit in these monolithic op amps. That's part of the reason that I built discrete op amps that had extraordinary bandwidth. And in the early version, I think we used a 5534 in the feedback, and then went with a discrete op amp. But the basic Pete circuit is an op amp with a bridge T on it, so it's the bridge T is a dip, and of course this produces a gigantic peak, 40 dB wide, and you change the Q by moving up and down this peak. You've got to have another op amp to invert that so that you have 2 negative inputs. The input of this main op amp, you need 2 negative inputs. You need the bridge T negative input, and you need this other negative input to control the peak. I'm not very good at describing this, but that other op amp went from a 5534 because I thought, well, who's going to hear this? And it's hearable, but it's not better. It's like when the early atomic clock came out, and he was selling tons of it, $5,000 for an atomic clock. And atomic clock was whatever it was, but his distributor, the next box that took the 10 megahertz and broke it down into 48K, 44, 196, whatever, was full of jitter. And guys would spend $10,000 on, and now this has changed, so don't take this as an evaluation of the new atomic clock. But guys would take this $10,000 investment and plug it in, and it sounded different. And thinking, man, that's great. It sounds different. No, that's not what they said. They said it sounds better. That's a mistake.
Oh, that's interesting.
That was a mistake. And a lot of times, like when digital came up, 1981, when we heard our first digital, we thought, wow, that sounds great. It really sucked. Listen to how quiet it gets. Well, that's because we hadn't had dither yet. We hadn't learned how to use dither yet. Reverb in the early CDs, reverb would go
Zipper out.
Fade and gone. Went away. Where's my ambience? Gone. And Sony Men of Science kept saying, and I knew these guys, kept saying, well, that's the way it should be.
That's a great point. Different being, there's so many times that you can hear difference, and then it's just like, I mean, I'm sure you haven't done this, but I can tell you many times on a large format console that I've EQ'd something, and then only to realize I was on the wrong fader. But I had convinced myself that I was EQing.
Happens all the time. Still happens to me from time to time. That's why I need a second engineer. I need somebody to look over my shoulder and say, tap, tap, tap.
We have to know what is better, not what is different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, there were for a while there, people were going around New York City with these IEC cables to plug your devices in that were supposed to make things sound better. And I couldn't get past the fact that it was plugged into Con Edison's power grid coming up this 180-year-old building. Do you remember these cables?
Well, I remember cables. I remember controversy. I remember my favorite story, by the way, is the Tice clock. Did you ever have a Tice clock in the control room?
I don't think so. No.
Let me see if there's some reference on it.
What is it? A clock? A digital clock?
Tice clock was a regular old Radio Shack clock. Radio Shack alarm clock with electronic readout. But George Tice, let me see if I can find it because this is brilliant. George Tice, Tice clock. George Tice clock. Oh, okay. So it was a Radio Shack clock that he had taken into his lab and had aligned the electrons. and you would put this clock in your studio anywhere, could go anywhere, and everything would sound better.
Oh,
everything would sound better. Oh, and by the way, the TV reception improved as well. So one of my very best friends in life, Sean Murphy, the brilliant mixer, orchestral mixer, lent me his Tice clock. And I wasn't hearing it, but I mean, I'd point to artists and say, look, when I plug this clock in, everything will sound better. And yeah, I think you're right. But look up the George Tice clock.
Okay.
I think it points to our desperation to find a magic bullet. I think
easy
that
answer. Yeah,
people are continually buying new plugins, searching for plugins rather than finding their craft and knowing where to place microphones and to do due diligence and listen critically.
Yeah.
They think the new plugin's going to be it.
And so you just stumble on something where I usually start the conversation, which is critical listening, is the first thing we teach in sound recording at McGill is critical. I love teaching, by the way. I love it a lot better than sitting in a small, dark room and drinking too much coffee. Critical listening, actually getting students to listen critically to EQs and compressors and reverb, codecs. Really listen critically. Listen until they can identify differences and to train their ears. That's the lesson of McGill sound recording. It's not where to put mics, although we have a great exercise that we do with kids where Richard and actually Denis and I will set up 5 different pairs of mics on an acoustic piano player, a Yamaha reproducer, that nobody can see, and the students have to listen to the same piece of music performed live, it's a reproducer, and to tell us what the microphones are, what the technology is, where they are on the acoustic piano. Wow. And that's a great exercise.
That's a learned behavior. I was surprised at how much of that you can train yourself to listen for. You don't have to be born with golden ears to slowly be able to learn.
There's no such thing as golden ears. It is something I learned a long time ago. There's no such thing. People accuse me of having golden ears. I don't have golden ears. I pay attention.
That's a great point.
Rupert Neve, as he was getting older, and we would get together more often in the old days than more recently, and of course not now, but he would say, over the years, George, my hearing has gotten worse, but my ability to listen has only gotten better. And I think that's how he stayed fresh, is he was always listening.
I think that's a great point for people who desperately want to do this, and they're afraid that they just aren't good enough. I was afraid as a young kid that I wasn't capable of doing it. I couldn't hear good enough. I didn't have the brain power to be able to do what I saw these guys doing. I didn't have the management skills or the musical ability. And the comfort is that if you want something bad enough, you spend enough time doing it, you learn these things. They're learnable behaviors.
I would have to say that the reason that I got into it was that I enjoyed music, is that I really loved music. And I found if the workflow was more transparent, that it would be a quicker path to joy, to coin a term. Path to joy, 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 joy. And a lot of people really want to be that recording engineer. They want to be Al Schmitt. They ought to know what it took to be Al Schmitt. The 5 marriages, the years before sobriety. They ought to know. They ought to know how tough it is. You guys got to watch this thing. It's great.
We'll put that up in the links on this. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, or I wanted you to talk a little bit about, because I learned this the older I got. In the old days, you take a parametric EQ, you crank it, you search a frequency, you cut the frequency. Okay. Yeah. I started to learn in my old age that once I did that, because there's a lot of frequencies that don't sound great, boosted 18 dB. You may be picking one you just don't like. That's not a problem, by the way. Right. But once you find a frequency, and I saw you doing this on your 8200, you bring it down deductively, and then you look around again.
Yeah,
with it dipped.
And it's almost invariably a different frequency that you'll dip. And the other thing, when I set up when I set up a mix and I hear stuff going on a guitar or a piano or something, I will find 5 or so different funny little things, and I'll find them, and then I'll zero the EQ, and I'll wait until I mix it to actually choose one of these and turn it down, see if it really makes a difference. If it doesn't make a difference, I'll leave it flat. Why not?
Right.
But it's already the research into that instrument and its artifacts, like a snare drum. Like I said, you don't want to take the rock and roll, that twang, that clank out of a snare drum. But just in case there's a frequency there on an equal footing with something in an acoustic guitar, and the frequency is a little off, you want to go in and maybe take that down. Or if the drummer hasn't tuned the drum, you maybe don't want that to be so predominant in the mix.
Yeah, I also felt like what you were EQing for in that piano, in that example, I'm going to put that little piano 8200 EQ thing in the description as well. What you were EQing, when you EQ'd your piano, you were EQing it for the vocal.
I was.
Which I think is lost on many people. It's like, look how beautiful that vocal worked when you got rid of that 2K in the piano.
Yeah.
It was astonishing. I've done it where I've been like, I've worked on my bass and then said, oh my goodness, my kick drum's changed.
That's a good example.
Who would have thought it?
That's a great example.
And then you end up, I always tell people like, hey, mixing a record. I have a school called Apprentice Academy. It's very hands-on. And I tell these guys, mixing a record is like having a conversation. If you're sitting there and a bus pulls by, you may understand what I'm saying, but you're not going to get any of the emotion of it. You're not going to get any of the timbre. You may miss some of the higher frequencies in my voice because the bus was raging in those frequencies. And it's unbelievable how much you can affect. If your vocalist can't get enough level in your vocal, maybe work in the electric guitars. If they're stepping on it, find what's stepping on it. It might be the piano.
Absolutely.
I think that's genius.
So when we're mixing a record from scratch, there's the stuff I'm doing right now. Today I'm remixing for Immersive. A friend of mine and I are working for this artist, and we did an Immersive record last year, and it was very well received. And so we're doing the rest of her catalog. And it's an interesting lesson because it starts with, I have to do a sound-alike of the original mixer's work. I have to start with demonstrating that I can remix the original mixer. It starts there. Because if the artist says, well, that doesn't sound like my record, you can say, well, here's your record, and turn all of the pan stuff off and turn the immersive reverbs off. So here's your record. Now, what do we want to do with it to make it live in an immersive space? Here's what happens when we fly this vocal around. How does that feel? So we're back to the original stereo mix that Manny Moroccan or Serban Gaina did, or Michael Brower, or any of these mixers that she's worked with. And they're not telling me how they do it. Believe me, Manny doesn't share. Sorry, Manny, I love you, babe, but he's crushing an SSL master bus. It's all analog, and I have to cop that. Hats off, Manny. That's great. But it has to be that original feel. You have to feel it. And when Nico Bolas asked Neil Young if he'd be willing to do an immersive, and Neil says, "Well, what's that?" I said, "Well, we're going to put it out in 7 speakers, 4 speakers." Can it sound like mono? So you start there. You start with the original. You start with the hit. You have to start with the hit, and then see what you can get away with.
That's an interesting point. Whenever I look at a technology like Immersive or 5.1 or anything, the question is, how do you eat an airplane, right? How do you do anything, right? So the idea that you have a concept of how to start something is a good indication that you've completed with some success. I think that's an important thing for us to learn and to take away from a conversation like this. It's like every record, you should have some idea that you're starting with. And then be sensitive along the way to go for opportunity or make it extraordinary or different. But it's like you have an idea on every project you start. You know what it is you're doing. You know where you're at on the map and where you're going to explore from. Because if you just pick up the pieces, 7 speakers seems like an impossible amount of options.
Well, and what the guys that I think aren't doing it as well as Eric Schilling. I work with Eric Schilling. And Eric Schilling goes back to doing 5.1s with Phil Ramone. I mean, Eric Schilling has just done great work over the years, especially with 5.1. We're in good mixes. We trade ideas back and forth. We listen to each other's mixes, and we really support each other. And I don't care who gets the mix. It could be an Eric mix or a me mix. I like Eric's mixes much better than I like my mixes. And sometimes he likes mine. But what I was going to say is it comes from a good foundation in 5.1. We made a lot of fucking mistakes in 5.1. And it was a complete failure. There was no business. It was a washout. And some people, like companies like DTS, wasted a lot of money trying to find a 5.1 music business. But eventually, some of us made some pretty good 5.1 mixes. Elliot Shiner's Steely Dan mixes come to mind on the later records. Babylon Sisters, for instance, is a really good mix in 5.1. North Dakota, off the Lyle Lovett record, is a really good mix in 5.1. I've Been to Memphis is a good mix in 5.1. And it's enough like the record that it works. But we learned there that it's got to feel right, and then you can do these things with it. Well, the guys that are fucking this up, if I may be indelicate, are the guys that work from stems. The original mixers delivered stems to the record company, so you got 6, 7, 8 stereo stems, all with effects baked in, and they're, moving those around, and it doesn't fucking work. It does not work. And so we'll be informed by the stems, but generally we'll go back to the original tracks and redo, especially delays or things that are spinning or better ambience. We've got some great reverberators. We've got the Spat Revolution, which is an amazing spatial processing and reverb program. It's expensive, and they're not giving them away. We've got the ISS Verb, the Fraunhofer Verb, which is completely brilliant. And so we have to recharacterize these mixes. And if you don't, you're not taking the best advantage of space. And some of the things that we do are very subtle, and they should be subtle.
Yeah. But it comes from a place of understanding the technology and then having to, once again, understand the original heart of the record.
Yeah.
which is
Absolutely.
given those two things, you got somewhere to go from there, which seems like an impossible task, but it distills it quite a bit. I wanted to ask you, my buddy Greg Vizza had a question about the gyrator. So I was reading about you, and it said that your professor, before you dropped out, said that this was a
theoretical circuit in Hopkins.
But it ended up in your EQ. So
it ended up in the first EQ. A gyrator is simply a way to transform conductances. So in I miss my dog. Who's got a dog?
That's my Maxine.
I miss my dog so much. That's where this came from. That's Charlie Joe. That's my border collie. Yeah, he's in Cape Breton with my wife. So I'm in Hopkins. I've already done the basics since 1966, 1967, and my sophomore year. I'm a terrible student. I've always been a terrible student. My sophomore year, I take a systems course, and systems course is all about matrices and systems design, matrix multiplication. And I've already got an equalizer, and I talk about the circuit that's able to transform a capacitor into what looks like an inductor. And back then, there weren't a lot of computers. I don't know whether you don't come from back then, but there was a Heathkit analog computer was the closest we came to an analog version of the IBM 7094 in the basement of the library. So he says, well, that's theoretical. There's no way you could have built that. And I realized that my time was wasted. My time at Hopkins, it was waste, except for the friends I made at the fraternity and some really good contacts, but college for me was a waste of time.
So this theoretical impossibility ended up having a life in the first version of your 8200.
No, the first version of the ITI, the original ITI, had a gyrator. No, the original ITI had an inductor.
Okay.
But the first, I think the first Sontec had a gyrator.
Okay.
To transform capacitor into what looks like an inductor.
I love that story. That's what we're in the business of, trying to do impossible things. And for somebody who is supposed to be encouraging you to dream big, to tell you something's not possible, I love the story that it actually became reality. Before we let you go, you've been way too generous. Let's do a real world, a little piece of advice for us. We know that the world is listening to our music on MP3s, right? When you're printing a mix, are you leaving headroom for intersample clipping? How are you generating your MP3s? And give us just a little bit into the...
That's a really good question, because I want to make the best mix I can make. I want to make, especially in 714, we have to depend on down mixing that to binaural right now, because it goes out as Sony 360RA. But I want to have the stems. I want to have not stems. I want to have the basic bed and all the objects on tracks where it could be repurposed down the road. So this thing about working on a record, when we send mixes home with artists, they've got to pump. It's got to come alive. We have to have light mastering, or maybe sometimes even heavy mastering in the mixes we send them home with on MP3s. And we try to do it at 320 or AAC 320 to get squeeze as much life out of it as we can, or squeeze as much life into it as we can, I should say. It squeezes life out of it. But when we deliver to mastering, invariably I will make a mix with that mastering chain, whatever that is. And I'll use what sounds right, even though in my heart I know it's shit, like an SSL channel strip, or an SSL, the basic SSL compressor on the center section. Still use that plug from time to time. It's not good, but it kind of sounds SSL-ish. But I'll print a flat mix. Now I'll EQ it, because you can reverse EQ for the most part. You can't reverse cut filters, high pass, low pass. You can reverse what you do in the middle, if you're careful. with peaks and shelves. You can reverse that. But the dynamics, I'll give Bob Ludwig, or I used to give Doug Sachs, I'll give them what the artist hears, has been listening to, which whatever that was in analog. I was a big fan of a Manley Vari-Mu because I like what it does to a kick. And it's a mess, but it sounds pretty cool. So they have a copy of that and the original when they go to master it for real, and they better beat what I've done. Because if they don't, the artist is going to pick what I've done. And I still do that. What do we do for MP3? Well, Bob Ludwig, who I have tremendous respect for, has maybe 4 different things that he masters for. He masters for a CD. He masters for an MP3. He masters for vinyl. So it can be put out for vinyl. And then he masters for download, like Tidal, 4824. And so maybe they're slightly different, but he's really optimizing for each channel. And I'll leave that up to him.
When you deliver a file to an artist, is there, let's say if you print a WAV file, are you leaving room in that WAV file for intersample clipping when it gets created into a low-res MP3?
Does an artist listen to intersample clipping?
Well, I mean, inadvertently they do. So, no, you're not.
No, generally they're listening for arrangement. So, I mean, I'm not sending out hi-fi mixes to artists. I'm sending out something so they can hear basic balances. They can hear the vocal in front. They can hear the ideas that they've had about the mix. You know, well, I like that guitar. I want to hear that guitar lick there. I want to hear that there. They can hear that. But as far as listening immersively, only a handful of artists have that playback capability.
Yeah.
Ronstadt did. I got her a system. She still uses the speakers. And she was able to hear the quality thing. Most artists aren't.
Well, we want to thank you for coming on and hanging out with us. Lots of insight into both the technical aspects of the work, but also the philosophy. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. You ask great questions. I really appreciate it. If you need a follow up on detail or I've gotten something wrong, just ask, because I do shoot from the hip and try to get it right.
It was great listening to you. I especially love the idea that you can think that something is messed up, but you love it creatively.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like when you're talking about that Vari-Mu, it's like, I get it. Yeah. It is, maybe there's something that is not perfect about it, but that's what the beauty of putting that with the right piece of music that will kick you in the butt, or get you in the heart.
In particular, when you're doing your mastering change, you're looking for something to glue things together a little bit. So that's more important at some point than tiny detail. But yeah, great questions, guys. Yeah.
The very best thing to take away from this is that you're going to be able to, you really need to be able to know how to take the information, analyze it, and then sometimes violate the rules of it.
That's
to come out with great outcomes. So thank you for helping us do that.
And take a look at the Al Schmitt thing. You guys are going to be amazed. It's long. It runs 2 hours. But
I saw that.
Every minute's worth it.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Mike.
Thank you,
Thanks,
George.
Joe.
Appreciate it.
That's it for the West Barn this week. We'll see you next time. Signing off.